True crime content has slowly become more and more popular over the years, with podcasts, TV shows, documentaries, and books being produced, covering some of the most mysterious crimes out there. There are some cases that everyone is familiar with, such as Ted Bundy or Heaven's Gate. And then there are cases that are almost too creepy and unbelievable to be true. Number 5. April 4th, 1991 should have been like any other day for Angela Hammond and her fiancé, Robert SHAFER. The two had recently found out that they were expecting their first child and were making preparations to welcome the child into the world. However, that opportunity would be taken away from Angela and Robert when a chance encounter at a payphone ended with tragedy and kickstarted one of Missouri's most mysterious missing person cases. 20-year-old Angela, better known as Angie, was a popular and outgoing young woman who was known to all in the small farming town of Clinton, Missouri. Angela and her family had moved to the small town when she was just 4 years old in 1975. And despite being outsiders in the small community, Angela quickly knit herself into the fabric of small-town life. Angela was the kind of woman who took everything in her stride, and in 1991, she had just started taking classes at the Central Missouri State University. This was just one of the good things happening in Angela's life, and in November of 1990, Angela had met the love of her life, 18-year-old Robert SHAFER, who was in his final year at Clinton High School. The two instantly fell head over heels for each other, and by January of 1991, they were engaged to be married and Angela was pregnant with their child. The news had come as a shock to the young couple, but true to Angela's nature, she took it all in stride and began making preparations for their baby, ensuring that it would have the best possible start in life. Sadly, neither Angela nor her baby would get to see that future, and the events of April 4th, 1991, play heavily on the minds of Clinton, Missouri residents. April 4th, 1991, Angela and her boyfriend, Kyla, and her fiancé, Robert, spent the day together at a barbecue. The friends stood around roasting sausages and talking about how excited they were to welcome baby Hammond into the world. As the evening wore on, the friends grew tired of the barbecue, and Robert informed Angela that he had to return home in order to babysit his younger brother. Kyla, Angela, and Robert piled into Angela's red 1987 Mustang and headed for Robert's house. The couple said their goodbyes, not knowing that the next time they met, it would be under very different and distressing circumstances. According to news reports, Kyla and Angela took advantage of the time they had together and drove around Clinton, talking about Angela's upcoming due date in September of 1991. Masha, Angela's mother, testified that Angela loved nothing more than driving around in their Mustang, and that she loved her friends and family dearly. After driving around for an hour or so, Angela and Kyla became tired, and even more so in Angela's case, as by this point she was 4 months pregnant, and there's no doubt that pregnancy-related fatigue was setting in. At around 11:15 p.m., Angela dropped Kyla off at her home and then drove to a payphone near Robert's house. The two had originally agreed to spend some time together when Robert's mother got home from work. However, as the night approached, Angela found that she was too tired. The reason that Angela stopped to use a payphone was that she didn't have a phone at home. She chose to stop at the payphone on East Jefferson Street, a decision that she would grow to regret. Sometime between 11:15 p.m. and 11:30 p.m., Angela picked up the payphone, inserted some change, and carefully began tapping the number of the SHAFER house. Robert was happy to hear her voice, and for a while, the pair chatted about everyday things. Angela explained that she was too tired to meet up with him, and promised him that they would see each other very soon. Little did Angela or Robert know that this would be the last time they ever spoke to each other. As Angela was on the phone, she noticed a strange man circling around the parking lot. In passing conversation, she mentioned this to Robert, who told her to keep an eye on him. The pair continued with their conversation. However, Angela's stomach sank when she saw the same man in a green 1969 Ford pickup truck pull up next to her. Angela tried to keep a hold on the situation, telling herself that the man was there to use the phone, and there was no reason to be scared. Despite what she told herself, something in Angela's gut didn't feel right, and she was correct to trust her instincts. Sensing that something was wrong, Angela began describing the man to Robert, telling him that the truck was a beat-up green pickup, and that the driver was scruffy and unkempt with glasses and long hair. Robert did his best to calm his fiancée and try to get a sense of the situation, even though he couldn't physically see her. For a while, it seemed that the strange man was going about his business just like Angela. That was until Robert heard a scream from the other end of the phone. Moments earlier, Robert had told Angela to ask the man if he needed to make a call. He figured that he was possibly hanging around because the other phone was broken, and he was just innocently waiting his turn. According to Angela, the man was more than happy to wait for Angela to finish up her call, and remained at his car and wait. It wasn't until Robert heard Angela's screams that he realized what was happening. In a panic, Robert jumped into his car, swung it out of the driveway, and raced to East Jefferson Street. Angela's scream echoed through his thoughts. He hoped and prayed that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, but as he approached East Jefferson Street, he knew that his nightmare was just beginning. As Robert drove closer, a green 1969 Ford pickup truck passed him, traveling at a terrifying pace. As the truck passed him, he heard Angela shouting his name. It was at this moment that he knew Angela was in the truck, and that she had been kidnapped by the mysterious man at the payphone. Robert sprung into action. He threw his car into reverse and began chasing the truck. In spinning his car around so fast, Robert had seriously damaged the transmission, hindering his ability to chase down Angela and her captor. Robert drove his damaged car as far as he possibly could, but just after a mile, his car sputtered and came to a grinding halt. He was forced to watch as the green 1969 pickup drove off into the distance, growing smaller and smaller by the second. He hoped and prayed that this had all been a bad dream and that he would be awoken to the sound of his alarm, pulling him back into the real world. Realizing that the chase was over, Robert headed to the nearest police station and recounted the horrific events that had just unfolded in front of him. By the next morning, news of Angela's abduction had spread across Clinton, shattering the notion that the small town was immune from the big city problems. Everyone in Clinton either knew Angela or knew of her and offered to help look for her. In the coming days, an updated description of the vehicle was released, with the Clinton Police Department announcing that the truck had a decal on the back window. The townsfolk of Clinton began looking at every green truck with an air of suspicion, and some residents even began pointing the finger at Robert. Some people in Clinton believed that Robert had staged the entire scene, and that he was the person responsible. He was questioned thoroughly, and it was determined that he had no involvement in Angela's case. 2 witnesses also came forward and testified that they had seen Angela at the phone box on the night of April 4th. These 2 witnesses told the Clinton Police Department that they had mistaken Angela as being one of their friends and drove closer in order to say hello. Upon closer inspection, they realized that Angela wasn't who they thought she was, and also noticed the Ford pickup truck in the car park too. Armed with this new witness testimony, the Clinton Police Department began searching through records of over 1,600 vehicles that matched the description of the car seen that night. Despite the extensive search, nothing ever came of it, and they found themselves back at square one. The residents of Clinton continued to be vigilant and keep their eye out for a green truck and any sign of Angela. But as the days passed, it became obvious that Angela might never be found. Angela's case had been connected to 2 similar cases in the area. On January 19, 1991, 42-year-old Trudy Darby's son hurried to the convenience store that she was working in Max Creek, Missouri, after she had made a panicked call to him, telling him that a weird man was hanging around at the front of the store, and that she had an uneasy feeling about him. Trudy's son got to the store as quickly as he could, but by the time he had arrived, there was no sign of his mother. Days later, Trudy's body was found on a riverbank not far from the shore. Then in February of '91, 30-year-old CHERYL Ann KENNEY disappeared from the convenience store where she worked in Nevada, Missouri, and the connection to Trudy's case was eerily similar. CHERYL Ann KENNEY remains missing, and the Clinton Police Department believe that the same man is responsible for all three crimes. Angela's mysterious disappearance sent shockwaves through the small community of Clinton, Missouri. And now, even 30 years later, the town still holds out hope that her case will be solved. In May of 2021, a shocking new development came to light that blew the entire case open. And hopefully, this new evidence means we're one step closer to figuring out what happened to Angela. The Clinton Police Department released an unseen ransom note that was given to them by an informant. The note was dated April 4th, 1991, the day that Angela went missing, and the details behind the note provide a chilling insight into a possible motive for Angela's disappearance. The unnamed informant was a star witness in a large upcoming court case in 1991, and was due to testify against some big names in the criminal underworld. The informant, whose name has been redacted to hide his identity, also had a daughter named Angela, and the two Angelas even bore a striking resemblance to one another. Police now believe that Angela Hammond was taken in a case of mistaken identity, and that the other Angela was actually the intended target. This was the last update made in Angela Hammond's case, and as of December of 2021, she remains a missing person. Anyone with information is urged to come forward, no matter how small or insignificant you believe that information may be. It may just be the vital clue that police are looking for. If you have any information, you're asked to contact the Clinton Police Department at 660-885-5561. Number 4. May 13th, 2008 was a day of celebration for 19-year-old Brandon Swanson of Marshall, Minnesota. Brandon had just completed his first year at Minnesota West Community and Technical College, and was looking forward to seeing what the next school year had in store for him in the wind turbine program. Brandon's family described him as a normal teenager who was starting to find his place in the world. His family could have never imagined that Brandon would become the center of one of Minnesota's most mysterious unsolved cases. After finishing up his final class of the year, Brandon said his goodbyes to his classmates and headed to his friend's house in Lind, Minnesota to kickstart the celebrations. Brandon spent a few hours here until leaving the party and heading to another friend's home in Canby, Minnesota, between 10:30 p.m. and 11 p.m. Those in attendance at the party in Lind said that Brandon had a few drinks throughout the evening, but was by no means intoxicated or unable to control his body. It's also believed that Brandon had a few drinks at his friend's house in Canby, and by midnight on May 14th, 2008, he was getting ready to return home. Just after midnight, Brandon said his goodbyes and hopped into his green Chevy Lumina and began driving towards Marshall, Minnesota, which is around 30 miles away if you take the quickest available route, using MN68E. The route along MN68 takes around 35 minutes according to Google Maps, with other routes taking upwards of 44 minutes, all of which are dependent on traffic, obviously. This is where the inconsistencies came in Brandon's case. According to friends, Brandon left just after midnight and should have been home at around 12:35 a.m. on May 14th, 2008. However, at 1:15 a.m. that evening, Brandon was still on the road and had in fact crashed his car into a ditch along a gravel road. He tried to call his friends, however they were either asleep or couldn't hear their phones buzz over the party. It's unknown how long Brandon attempted to contact his friends, but the next known movements of Brandon aren't until 1:54 a.m. when he reluctantly called his parents, Annette and Brian, in Marshall, Minnesota, and asked them to come help him. Brandon told his parents that he was stranded somewhere between Marshall and Lind, giving them more accurate details where he could. Brandon reassured them by telling him that he walked away unharmed from the accident and just needed a ride back home. As Annette and Brian pulled up to Brandon's location, they were met with a lonely and desolate road. Thinking that there had been a miscommunication, Annette called Brandon and asked him where he was. Brandon told her the same location as before, and the two devised a system to help find one another. At the end of the phone, Brian heard his wife Annette shouting, "We're flashing our lights," but neither Brandon nor Annette and Brian could see each other. This quickly made both parties frustrated, and Brandon eventually ended the call after losing his patience. Annette called her son back, and the two exchanged apologies and began formulating a plan once more. This time, Brandon told his mother that he could see the lights of Lind, and said that he was going to walk towards him, and that it would be easier for the three to meet there. Annette and Brian agreed to this plan and jumped back into their car and headed towards the town of Lind. Not wanting Brandon to walk alone in the dark, Brian stayed on the phone with Brandon while he walked through the fields and wooded areas to Lind, or at least what he believed to be the town of Lind. The father and son chatted back and forth about daily life and how the final day of his first year of college was. In the background, Brian heard running water, twigs snapping, and the sound of gravel crunching underneath Brian's feet. 45 minutes had now passed, and Annette and Brian were anxiously waiting for Brandon to meet them at their prearranged spot, but he never arrived. At the 47th minute of the phone call, the calm conversation quickly descended into chaos. Out of the blue, Brandon shouted an expletive followed by the sound of someone falling and slipping before the call disconnected. Panicked, Brian and Annette desperately tried to phone back their son, but each time the phone rang out. They hoped and prayed that Brandon wasn't injured, and hoped that the running water was only shallow. The early morning hours of May 14th, 2008 crept in, with Brian and Annette still desperately trying to reach their son. Brandon's phone had once rung out, but now the calls went straight to voicemail, sending a shiver down their spine. At 6:30 a.m. on the morning of May 14th, Brian and Annette drove to the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office and officially reported their son missing. In the beginning, the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office was less than cooperative with Brandon's family, and assured them that he had partied too hard the night before and would be home very soon. Unfortunately, their negligence led to precious time being wasted and valuable clues being lost, and 13 years later, Brandon still remains missing. Hours passed, and Brandon still had not made contact with his friends or family. And finally, at the insistence of Annette and Brian, Brandon was classified as a missing person, and an investigation began. The first task for the sheriff's office was to figure out Brandon's last known movements. Through interviewing Annette, Brian, and Brandon's friends, they were able to piece together the events of the day before. Now that Brandon had been reported missing, the police were able to obtain his phone records, which yielded them some very interesting clues. When Brandon called his parents at 1:54 a.m., he told them that he was somewhere between Marshall and Lind. However, the last ping from his phone indicated that he had actually been in Porter, Minnesota, which is northeast of both Lind and Marshall. According to Google Maps, Porter is about 27 miles from Lind. If you take the M68 from Canby to Marshall, you pass through Porter. That leaves the question, why did Brandon think he was in Lind, some 27 miles away? Is it possible that he had more to drink than his friends had let on, or had Brandon simply gotten confused in the dark? Search and rescue teams were sent out to look for Brandon and his car, and by dinner time, the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office had located his Chevy Lumina in Taunton, 6 miles outside of Porter. While his car had gotten stuck, there were no obvious signs of damage to the car and no evidence to suggest any foul play at the scene. With this discovery, the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office hoped that they were one step closer to locating Brandon. Search crews continued well into the morning hours and set about searching again the next day. Brandon's disappearance shocked the community of Marshall, and his college friends were devastated to learn that he had gone missing. In the months after his unexplained disappearance, Searches were conducted and a multi-agency approach was utilized in order to locate Brandon quickly and safely. However, 13 years later, we're still wondering what happened to Brandon Swanson on the night of May 14, 2008. The prevailing theory is that Brandon tripped and fell into a river, which would explain his final words to his father, Brian. Brian told investigators that Brandon described hearing running water near him while he was on the phone, and it's likely that Brandon had lost his way in the dark. Brandon's parents have come to terms with the fact that their beloved son may no longer be with them. Annette said in an interview for the Pioneer Press, quote, "Maybe I'm a terrible mother for this. I don't know, but I felt very early on, before the first 48 hours were up, that something terribly wrong had happened." Without answers, all we can do is speculate, and the internet is abuzz with theories and ideas of what could have happened to Brandon Swanson. Brandon leaves behind a legacy of Brandon's Law, which was enacted in May of 2009 and spearheaded by his parents. Brandon's Law dictates that law enforcement must take a missing person report without delay when a person is missing under dangerous circumstances. This law was not around to protect Brandon. However, his parents have made sure that no other family will have to endure what they endured in the initial hours of Brandon's disappearance. Anyone with information in Brandon's case is urged to come forward, no matter how small or insignificant it may be. If you have any information, you're asked to contact the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office at 507-694-1664. Number 3. Fisherman Mark Peterson cast his net overboard his boat, the Lady Marian, on August 11, 1994, in Australia's Hawkesbury River. Mark hoped that the day would be a prosperous one, and he would have plenty of fish to take to the market. He waited, and when the time felt right, he slowly began to tug at the net, hoisting it back onto the boat. He noticed that the net beneath him felt heavier than usual, and counted his lucky stars. As he pulled the net onto the boat, he realized it wasn't a bountiful haul of fish, but a large steel crucifix with plastic bags concealing something. Mark knelt down and took a closer look at the crucifix, and he found that the plastic bags contained human remains, with parts of the remains being skeletonized. He immediately summoned the police to the scene, who were horrified at what they had found. They confirmed that the remains were human, and thus started one of Australia's creepiest unsolved cases. This discovery shocked the local police. While the area was no stranger to crime, the brutal nature of this discovery left them wondering who would be capable of such an act. The man's body and the crucifix were transported to the New South Wales Institute for Forensic Science, and Dr. Christopher Lawrence was taken with performing a full examination and autopsy. Dr. Lawrence began by removing the plastic bags that covered the body, and found that the man was wearing a polo shirt and pants, but nothing else. The unknown man had only a pocket of saggy cigarettes and a lighter in his pocket. There was no identification, no wallet, and no other belongings to be found. In absence of his true identity, the New South Wales police took to calling him the Rack Man. Dr. Lawrence was able to determine that Rack Man had suffered trauma to the head, but was unable to determine whether this was before or after he was tied to the makeshift crucifix. A description was released to the public in the hopes that someone would come forward and claim him. He was described as a white male, 21 to 46 years old with dark hair. As he had been in the water for between 6 and 12 months, it was hard for Dr. Lawrence to discern anything else about him, such as eye color. The time that Doe had spent in the water had significantly degraded his fingerprints. Forensic investigators also found that the DNA samples obtained were of poor quality, and struggled to obtain good results when running tests. With nowhere else to turn, the New South Wales Institute of Forensic Science called in the assistance of forensic odontologist Dr. Chris Griffiths. Dr. Griffiths informed Dr. Lawrence and the investigators working on the case that Doe's face appeared to have been misshapen, but did not elaborate on this further. He also noted that his upper right molar had been removed during childhood, giving the New South Wales Police a fresh clue to work with. The New South Wales Police began scouring missing person reports, looking for anyone who matched the description of Rackman, but they came up empty-handed. In the following years, the New South Wales Police worked with the TV show Australia's Most Wanted to create a facial approximation image of the unidentified man, and circulated his details around through the TV show and through flyers and posters all across New South Wales. A large reward was also offered, and this prompted people to come forward with information that seemed viable at the time. The airing of Rackman's story led to 3 possible identities. The first identity that the New South Wales Police considered was Joe Biviano, who disappeared from Sydney in 1993. Biviano had a previous record, and his physical characteristics matched those of Rackman's. The New South Wales Police quickly ran into other problems, however, as Biviano didn't have any dental records on file for comparison. It wasn't until one of his relatives was tracked down and a DNA sample was provided that it was found that Biviano was not Rackman, and the investigation was back at square one. The second person that was considered was Peter MITRIS, a Greek businessman who had disappeared from King's Cross, Sydney in 1991. After speaking with Peter's family and making several media appeals, the New South Wales Police received information that Peter had met a similar fate to that of Rackman. Now they had to determine whether Peter was the unidentified man, or whether they had another unsolved case on their hands. Peter's family were contacted and DNA samples were obtained, which showed that he was not the man found on that day in 1994. His family also commented that his teeth were different, and that most of the physical characteristics, such as his height, didn't match. The third and final person that was considered was Max TANCEVSKI, who was last seen on January 11, 1993 by his partner in Newton, Sydney. At the time of his disappearance, Max was in a deep gambling addiction and was known to travel up and down Australia, more specifically to the Gold Coast, to indulge in gambling binges. Different sources give different accounts. Some sources state that $1,800 was withdrawn after his disappearance. However, others state that $1,800 was withdrawn before his disappearance. Either way, when Max disappeared, so did a large chunk of his money, and it was believed that Max's gambling debts finally caught up to him. However, without any evidence, his partner and his family were left without answers. Each tip led the police to a dead end, and they quickly became frustrated with the lack of progress in the case. After focusing heavily on the unidentified man, they turned their attention to the metal crucifix and hoped that it may hold the answers. The New South Wales Police worked with experts to determine that the crucifix had been carefully created by an experienced metalworker or welder. They also determined that it had been made to measure specifically for the victim and had been meticulously created just for him. This deeply disturbed the police, and they began wondering whether the person or persons responsible had ties to an organization that sought revenge upon the unidentified man. Years passed, and the New South Wales Police continued their investigation, hoping that one day they would figure out the identity of the man, only known as Rackman. They never gave up hope in his case, and explored every avenue possible. The police consulted with forensic experts, metal companies, and the public to try and uncover the mystery, but to no avail. The Rackman sat unidentified, and all the New South Wales Police could do was theorize. Police noted that the crucifix was very heavy, too heavy for one person to lift and place into the water. They began working with the theory that there were multiple accomplices, and this sent the media into a spin. Once the police announced that they may have had multiple people involved, newspapers began running with the theory that Rackman had been part of a satanic cult's ritual, or that he was possibly targeted by organized crime groups. These rumors did nothing but hinder the investigation, and these outlandish theories only pushed leads and tips further away. People began to worry that if they came forward, the elusive group who were responsible would come after them and their families. The investigation quickly ran cold, and it wasn't until 2018 that the police finally had a breakthrough. Years passed since Rackman was found in '94, and new investigators with fresh eyes decided to take another look at the case. They examined all of the evidence and began looking through a pool of suspects to determine which was the most likely candidate. After evaluating the evidence, the police determined that Max TANCEVSKI, who had disappeared in '93, was their most likely candidate. And as it would turn out, they were right. After obtaining a DNA sample from Max's relatives, they found that the Rackman found in '94 was indeed missing Max TANCEVSKI. Max had been considered a likely identity early on in the investigation, and it's unknown why his details and DNA were not compared sooner. Finally, the police had their victim, and now it was time to find the person or people responsible. Sadly, the police are still no closer to determining who did this to Max, and why they disposed of him in such an elaborate manner. The case now remains one of Australia's creepiest unsolved crimes. Anyone with information in Max's case is urged to come forward. There's currently a $100,000 reward for information that leads to an arrest. So if you have any information, you're asked to contact the New South Wales Police at 131-444 or 612-4353-0444. Or you can contact Crime Stoppers at 1-800-333-000. Number 2. Ricky McCormick was born on June 14, 1958 in St. Louis, Missouri, and spent most of his early life struggling to get grips with the American education system. Ricky's own mother, Frankie Sparks, described him as developmentally slow, and said that he struggled with reading and writing. By the time he had reached Martin Luther King High School, the cracks were beginning to show. The school administrators would often phone his mother to ask if everything was okay, as Ricky spent much of his time alone, staring into space on the playground. Ricky struggled with reading and writing, and at best could only write his own name. He dropped out of high school and found work wherever he could. This wasn't enough for Ricky, and he hated living what he called the poor life. So in an attempt to gain money and notoriety, he began engaging in petty crimes to try and better his situation. Shortly after Ricky dropped out of high school, his family noticed that his mental health was taking a turn for the worse. His Aunt Gloria described how Ricky would talk as if he was in another world, and often struggled with the perception of reality. Alongside his mental health issues, Ricky also had chronic heart issues, which saw him in and out of the hospital, and affected his ability to hold down a steady job. When he did work, he much preferred to work the night shift, covering himself in the cloak of darkness. For years, Ricky struggled with everyday life, doing his best to provide for himself and his 4 children that he'd fathered throughout different relationships. In 1992, Ricky was arrested and charged in connection with one of these relationships, as the girl was underage. He served just 13 months of a 3-year sentence, and soon he was back on the streets looking for opportunities to make money. After getting out of prison, Ricky found himself in with the wrong crowd once again. He quickly found a job at an Amoco gas station in downtown St. Louis, and soon found out that his bosses weren't as clean as they made themselves out to be. Juma Hamdallah, who went by the name David Radigan, and his brother, Baha Hamdallah, had taken over the Amoco gas station in 1994 and used it as a front for more nefarious deeds. The two would use the gas station as a front to move large quantities of illegal substances through St. Louis and into the suburbs. So when Ricky began working for them, they knew that he was a naive and vulnerable person, and with the right amount of money, they could use him to do their dirty work. After building a relationship with Ricky, they brought him into the business and convinced him to travel down to Florida to collect packages for them and bring them back up to St. Louis. This pattern continued, with the naive Ricky doing whatever the brothers told him. But in June of 1999, this all changed when Ricky fell off the map after doing one last run for the brothers. It's never been confirmed whether the Hamdallah brothers had anything to do with what happened next. And 22 years later, Ricky's case remains a complete mystery. On June 30th, 1999, the body of a man was discovered in a field in West Alton, Missouri, just off Route 367, an isolated and quiet stretch that doesn't see much traffic or footfall. The local police were immediately called to the scene and found that the body was in an advanced stage of decomposition, most likely due to the Missouri heat. The body was transported back to the medical examiner's office, and through the use of fingerprints, they were able to identify the body as that of 41-year-old Ricky McCormick. Ricky had not been officially reported missing, and according to those around him, he had last been seen on June 25th, 1999 at the Forest Park Hospital in St. Louis. Sources say that Ricky was at the hospital for a checkup, and we know that he suffered from the chronic heart and lung conditions mentioned a moment ago. This led investigators to wonder whether Ricky had a medical emergency while out in rural West Alton, but an autopsy was unable to confirm or deny that. The coroner noted that the state of decomposition was very advanced for the 5 days that Ricky had possibly been outside. The coroner was only able to comment that he'd suffered a head injury, but was not able to determine any other causes or injuries. The verdict was recorded as undetermined, and now the police had to figure out what happened to Ricky, whether they were dealing with a homicide or not. With an undetermined verdict and signs of injury, the police led with the theory that Ricky was a victim of foul play. Ricky's final resting spot also led them to this, as the cornfield where Ricky was found was over 15 miles away from St. Louis. After speaking with Ricky's family and girlfriend, the police learned that Ricky didn't own a car, and there were no modes of public transport that serviced the area. This meant that somebody had left him in that field, hoping that its rural location meant that he would never be discovered. Unfortunately for them, Ricky's body was discovered, but even in 2021, we're still no closer to solving the mystery of what happened to him. After his body was found, his family, friends, and girlfriend were interviewed and asked whether there was anybody who had a motive for doing this. The St. Louis police were met with a resounding no, but then Ricky's girlfriend, Sandra Jones, remembered details about a trip that he took on June 15th, 1999, to Orlando, Florida. On June 15th, Ricky hopped onto a Greyhound bus headed for Florida and found himself a hotel for the night. During his stay, Ricky made several calls to Sandra, the Amoco gas station, and numerous other people in Orlando. The police were able to uncover evidence that Ricky had placed calls to people in Orlando the days and weeks before his arrival. Sandra told the police that Ricky would often travel down to Orlando for the Hamdallah brothers and bring back packages in Ziploc bags. He never really talked about his business trips to Sandra, preferring to keep the details concealed. However, after his June 15th trip, Sandra told police that Ricky seemed scared and more erratic than usual. When he returned from Orlando, his behavior had changed and he had begun to act out, displaying strange and troubling behavior. So when his body was discovered on June 30th, 1999, Sandra had a terrible feeling that the Hamdallah brothers were somehow involved. She theorized that Ricky had somehow messed up in Florida, and that the brothers made him pay for his mistakes. However, without any solid evidence, no one was ever charged or arrested. Tips came in, but nothing substantial ever came, much to the dismay of the St. Louis Police Department and much to the frustration of Ricky's family. All they wanted were answers, and for the person responsible to be behind bars. Then, in 2012, Ricky's case took yet another confusing turn. What the police hadn't revealed to the public about Ricky's case was that upon searching his pockets, they'd found 2 handwritten, cryptic notes filled with a bizarre string of letters and numbers. This development shocked the public and Ricky's family, who found out about the notes through the news. They also revealed that since 1999, their cryptanalysis and racketeering records unit had been trying to crack the ciphers without any luck. Ricky's family were both puzzled and outraged at the new development, insisting to the FBI that Ricky couldn't read or write and was barely able to write his own name. His mother spoke with FBI agents and testified that she would regularly help her son fill out paperwork due to his illiteracy. However, in contradicting accounts, some family members said that Ricky was known to write coded messages for himself, but that they could not offer up a solution to these puzzles. The FBI has been working tirelessly since 1999 to crack these messages, and now they're asking for the public's help. Some online sleuths have theorized that these cryptic letters could be postage codes, or area codes, or even bus routes that relate to Ricky's criminal activity. Others believe that Ricky was actually schizophrenic, but that this had gone undiagnosed. Ricky's family did tell police that his behavior was always eccentric and bizarre, and that he'd suffered from mental health issues in the past. The mysterious cryptic notes left behind by Ricky McCormick have haunted the FBI for over 22 years, and they're asking for your help. Some of the best minds in the USA have tried to crack these codes, but thus far have been unable to. If you have any information, you're asked to contact the FBI's Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit via their website, or you can write to them at 2501 Investigation Parkway, Quantico, Virginia, 22135, attention Ricky McCormick case. Anyone with information in Ricky's case is urged to come forward, no matter how small or insignificant you believe that information may be. It may just be the vital clue that police are looking for. There's currently a $100,000 reward for information that leads to an arrest. And if you have any information, you're asked to contact the St. Louis Police Department at 314-444-5371. Number 1. 20-year-old Ashley Loring Heavyrunner was a member of the Montanan Blackfeet Indian Reservation and was known to those in the local community as a bright, positive, and big-hearted young woman. Her heart extended to all corners of society, and according to Ashley's older sister, Kimberly, Ashley was passionate about helping to bring attention to the cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women across the US and Canada. Indigenous women are twice as likely to experience violence than any other group, and they're disproportionately represented in homicide and crime statistics. In Montana, Indigenous people make up 6.7% of the population. However, they account for 26% of the state's missing person cases. These cases are also underrepresented in the media, and police forces are less likely to take action when an Indigenous woman goes missing. This is something that Ashley was aware of, and she wanted to help in any way that she could. Neither Kimberly nor Ashley could have predicted that Ashley would have become one of those women that she fought so fiercely to protect and find. In June of 2017, Kimberly Heavyrunner had just returned from the holiday of a lifetime to Morocco, and there was one person she couldn't wait to see: Ashley. In the weeks before the holiday, Ashley had gotten herself a new apartment in Missoula, and the two arranged for Kimberly to help her move in. At the time, Ashley was studying environmental science at the Blackfeet Community College, and everything seemed to be going well for her. As Kimberly made her way to the reservation in Browning, Montana, an uneasy feeling swirled around in her stomach. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she knew that something was off. When she returned home, she began calling Ashley, excited to tell her about her trip and to help her move, but there was no answer. This was extremely out of character for Ashley, so Kimberly decided to contact some of her friends on Facebook. Ashley's friends told Kimberly that the last time they had seen or heard from Ashley was on June 15, 2017, at a party on the reservation. The friends even showed Kimberly messages from Ashley, asking for a ride into town that night. From what we know, Ashley made it to the property, and one of her friends uploaded a video of her at the property on June 5, 2017. Ashley had also messaged Kimberly on June 5, 2017, asking to borrow some money, and of course, being the protective bigger sister, Kimberly asked if everything was okay, and Ashley assured her that it was. After the party, nobody saw or heard from Ashley again, and when the father was hospitalized and Ashley hadn't called or shown up, the heavy runners knew that something was very wrong. Realizing that Ashley was missing, her family turned to the Blackfeet law enforcement, who have jurisdiction over 1.2 million acres in the area. The Blackfeet law enforcement didn't take Ashley's disappearance seriously, and swept her case under the rug, telling her family that she was an adult and she could come and go as she pleased. Days passed and there was still no sign of Ashley. The Blackfeet law enforcement then decided it was finally time to launch a search for Ashley, and after just 3 days the search was called off, much to the frustration of Ashley's family. Progress in Ashley's case stalled, and it wasn't until 2 months after she was last seen that the Bureau of Indian Affairs finally took on her case. In those interim months, Ashley's friends and family canvassed the reserve and conducted their own investigation, and that investigation paid off. 2 weeks after Ashley was last seen, a possible sighting was reported. The tipster claimed that they had seen a young woman matching Ashley's description, running from a car on US Highway 89 on the Blackfeet Reservation. This part of the reservation is described as desolate and has swamps and forested areas, so Ashley's family thought that she may have encountered trouble here while running away from someone. Since the Blackfeet law enforcement nor the Bureau of Indian Affairs were doing anything, Kimberly and her family decided that they would start their own search of the area. Word got out about the search, and volunteers showed up to show their support and help Ashley's family in any way they could. This independent search proved to be more successful than any that had been conducted by law enforcement. And just days into the search, Ashley's family had found their first clue. As volunteers made their way through the bushy forests and swamps, they came across a gray jacket. According to Ashley's friends, they believed that she was wearing the jacket on the night that she disappeared. Armed with this new clue, Kimberly called the Bureau of Indian Affairs and handed it over to them for forensic testing. Sadly, the jacket sat in a box at the Bureau of Indian Affairs for months after it was handed over. Kimberly had been desperately chasing the results of these tests every single day, only to find out that it had been tossed aside and forgotten about. Then another search conducted by Ashley's family turned up more items of clothing, this time a torn jacket and a pair of boots. Both items had smears of red on them and left Ashley's family fearing the worst. This second discovery was made close to the home of 52-year-old Sam McDonald, who Ashley was known to hang around with, even if her family didn't approve of it. Sam was actually with Ashley on the night that she disappeared, and this new crowd of people that she'd been hanging around with were a lot older than her, and were known to use illegal substances, something that Ashley had begun doing herself. When questioned by Ashley's family, Sam told them that he and Ashley had been partying for a few days, and that on the morning of June 11th, 2017, she asked him to drive her to another area in the reservation. Sam alleges that Ashley was meeting with someone called V-Dog, and that he fell asleep at the meeting spot while waiting for this mysterious person. He told Ashley's family that he assumed Ashley had gotten out of his car and had continued her journey with V-Dog, so he left and went about his day. Ashley's family, of course, passed this on to law enforcement, and the discovery of items of clothing with suspicious smears on them only made Sam appear more suspicious. Despite this, Sam was never arrested or charged in connection with Ashley's disappearance, and according to Kimberly, these pieces of clothing were also never submitted for testing. It was later revealed that V-Dog was in fact the nickname of 50-year-old Paul Valenzuela, who was known across the reservation for all the wrong reasons. Paul had previously picked up charges for burglary and weapons charges, and at the time of Ashley's disappearance, her family confirmed that the two had been seeing each other. Paul was also married to Tashina Running Crane, and not long after Ashley disappeared, the couple filed for divorce. Their relationship had been rocky, and a divorce seemed inevitable. However, after Ashley's disappearance, Tashina, also known as T, began making bizarre statements. In a now removed YouTube video titled "Set Up," T sat in front of the camera and claimed that Paul was responsible for Ashley's disappearance, and that he was trying to frame her. In the video, she says, quote, "Basically, he has Ashley and everybody in this town knows it. Paul is trying to set me up." She would later take down this video and retract all of her statements in regards to Paul. It wasn't until 2018 that the FBI became involved in Ashley's case, and even then, the investigation was disorganized and chaotic. The FBI later admitted that there was no clear direction, and that they were unsure as to who was the lead agency in Ashley's case. Updates on her case have been few and far between, and Kimberly still holds on to hope that the right person will come forward with the right information. With each anniversary that passes, the pain only deepens for her family, and they hope that one day they will find peace. Anyone with information in Ashley's case is asked to come forward. There's currently a $50,000 reward for information provided by Ashley's family and the Up and Vanished podcast. If you have any information, you're asked to contact the FBI's Salt Lake City office on 801-579-1400, or the Blackfeet Law Enforcement on 406-338-4000, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs Rocky Mountain Regional Office at 406-247-7943. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.